Let me now introduce a fantastic panel that we have. First, Ms. Jyoti Bisbey, who is the Executive Committee Member and Head of Partnerships of WAPPP. She's a global expert with more than 20 years of experience on green and resilient infrastructure finance and PPPs in developing countries. She worked with the World Bank Group. She worked with the United Nations, as I said, preparing PPP projects, but also financing climate action in infrastructure. She works with the Fast Infra label. She is in the Executive Advisory Committee, and then she leads the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Technical Panel on the peers infrastructure evaluation and rating system. And Jyoti will tell us a little bit more about WAPPP and what they're doing in this area. Our second panelist is Ms. Cristina Albuquerque, who is the director of the Global Electric Mobility at the World Resources Institute Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, and where she works really to manage and expand WRI portfolio on zero-emission fleets that I was describing earlier for public transportation, for freight, and for 2- and 3-wheelers globally that are such an important part of the overall climate transition in this process. And she's connecting with us from Brazil. And our third panelist is Ms. Jing Chao, who is a senior public-private partnership specialist at the World Bank, now based in Mozambique, where she's leading the work program on energy and infrastructure. And before Mozambique, she was with the World Bank Infrastructure, PPPs, and Guarantees Group. Before the World Bank, actually, she worked on the structuring and financing of large infrastructure projects with a couple of law firms. And we are super happy. This is a very diverse panel, and we expect to have a really interesting conversation, but the quality of the conversation depends on the quality of questions that you ask in the chat function. So please feel free at any point to start putting your questions, which I will be monitoring and bringing to the conversation. We're going to start with a quick round of introduction of the organizations where our panelists are coming from, so that you get a feel for what is their background and how do they connect to the conversation. So we'll go first with Jyoti to tell us a little bit about WAPPP, Cristina, WRI, and Jenny from the World Bank perspective of the work in Africa. Jyoti.
All right, thank you, Ede. Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, everyone. It's really great to meet all of you. I can see that everybody's coming from all parts of the world, so this is perfect a panel for really bringing all the issues, global issues, on the table on PPPs. I'm a finance specialist, PPP specialist by training, and I'm representing today the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. It is the largest industry association for PPP professionals, and we have over 60 PPP units, and it encompasses all countries, not just developing countries. So we have, and the way we work is we basically have, it's a member-driven organization, and members basically drive the chapters. So we have chapter for North America, for example, for Africa, for South Asia, for Eastern Europe. We also have thematic chapters, finance, and we also have sectoral chapters for water, for philanthropy, for sustainability and resilience. So it's really a member-driven association where we are really coming together and working as one on what really is happening in the PPP world, how the public sector is behaving, how the private sector is behaving. So the members are really coming from both the public sector and the private sector. We have lots of companies as our members. So it's really a comprehensive way to look at the issues from perspective of the entire market. And that's what it's really wonderful. And let me also mention what Ede had mentioned when he was introducing me, the Fast Infra label. I'm on the executive board for Fast Infra label. It is a joint initiative by Bloomberg, Climate Policy Initiative, and some of the MDBs. And it is really geared towards the private sector, the asset managers. And I'm sure we've all had this conversation working on projects on the asset class and what does it really mean to be a sustainable infrastructure asset class in a particular sector, or even when the portfolio managers are making their assessments on multiple types of infrastructure, but looking at one common indicator, and how do these really work together. So Fast Infra Label is a joint initiative, and really it's a comprehensive data driven from Bloomberg, and you may be very familiar with Bloomberg, which is also doing the TCFD. And the other one is the UNECEs. Let me just say this because in support all the people understand that peers methodology is geared towards the public sector in terms of project preparation, again to really bring this facility to understand what sustainability means in their own projects. That's it for me.
Wonderful.
Thank you
very much, Cristina. Tell us about WRI and the work that you're doing in Brazil.
So thank you all for the invitation to be here. I hope you can hear me outside area based for internet connections, but it's a little windy. So nice to be here. So work at the WRI, World Resources Institute. We are a think tank organization that really looks to implement solutions on the ground in different priority countries that you work with. And the WRI World Center for Sustainable Cities, that's the program within WRI that I'm based on. We work with cities solutions. So really looking for urban areas in different areas of work. So we have work in urban efficiency and climate, and urban development and urban mobility. So I'm also seated in the urban mobility work. It really helps cities, countries, local governments, and also private sector companies to really implement sustainable solutions in urban mobility. And more specifically, my role at WRI, I'm overseeing our, as Ed said in the beginning, the electric mobility work. So really helping countries and cities to understand in a different context how they could apply these new technologies in freight, two-wheelers, and public transport systems, and how is the best way to create their own business model, their own solutions for PPPs or any other contracts to really be able to decarbonize their transport systems in the reality. So really play a role of advisors for seat stakeholders, for national governments, but also work with private sector to really understand and make this bridge between governments and private sector companies to really implement the solutions and benefit people and improve urban context implementations of solutions on the different countries. We mainly work in development countries, so in the global south countries, so Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, but we also have some works in the US. Right now, a lot in the school bus field, also helping children to have better access to electric school buses in the context, and also have exploring even more some work with European countries to really help them to decarbonize their transport sector.
Wonderful, Cristina. And Jenny, everybody knows about the World Bank, but tell us a few facts that hopefully nobody knows, and especially your work in Africa in energy.
Sure, thank you, Eddie. And first of all, I want to say very interesting discussion so far. So thank you so much for inviting me to the discussion. And I also want to give kudos to the organizing team because it's an all-female panel, this workshop. And I have to say, I started working on PPPs about 15 years ago, and that would never have happened. So we're talking about change, and I think there's a lot of changes happening now. The World Bank, needs probably no introduction, but let me spend a little bit of time talking about how we support PPPs. So I started my career in the bank working with Jyoti in a group that currently is called the Infrastructure PPPs and Guarantees Group, although I think it's changing its name again. And it's actually a very small group within the bank that kind of has, I would say, three main work programs. One is we give technical assistance to PPP units, MOFs, etc., so directly to the client, and most of it is kind of based on, like I said, technical assistance grants. We have some in-house funds, including PPIAF, which I'm sure everybody here is familiar with. And with these grants, we give a lot of, like I said, technical assistance advice on strengthening PPP units, project preparation, PDFs, etc. We also act as a bit of an internal consultants to our colleagues within the bank working on lending operations, where those lending operations have a PPP element. So we give cross support, or we call cross support internally, to our transport colleagues, our energy colleagues, our water colleagues, whenever they're working on some complex projects that may have a PPP element. And then we also, like I mentioned, we manage large trust funds, and then we also manage the internal corporate targets on private capital mobilization. So something I wanted to mention, that not everyone's aware that the World Bank actually has really strong corporate targets on trying to leverage and mobilize as much private sector capital as we can with our limited public funding. And we're the group that, or IPG is the group that kind of manages that, monitors it, and tries to increase it. So what else do we do on PPPs? The other point I wanted to make is that often when it comes to innovation and disruptive technology, frankly, most of the time, these new technologies are tested in the developed world, right? In Europe, in the US, and Australia. And once it kind of reaches past the very, very pilot phase, it starts getting rolled out in developing countries, the risk allocation completely changes with these new technologies. And often the bank is asked to come in on these first projects, these first mover projects on newly tested technologies, I would say. Rarely is it untested, but it's newly tested technologies, such as, for example, green hydrogen, of course, solar back in the day, wind back in the day, and do the first deals in countries where, like I said, there's already other risks present, and developers may not be as comfortable taking some of these technology risks. I think that's a really important role we play. We give this halo effect, and we also support with our de-risking instruments, guarantees, and like I said, we really try to leverage that in private investment. And then once the technology is more or less proven, we really try to scale in our client countries. And that is really the support that we try to give on PPPs. So let me stop there, but thank you very much.
That sounds very good. Now we're going to move into very practical case studies. We found that our audiences really like the description of specific cases, the challenges that they face, the solutions that they provided. So I'm going to switch around a little bit the order of the panel just to keep it interesting. And let me start with Cristina, because when we were preparing this workshop, we came across one of the publications of the work that you have been doing on electric buses in Brazil, where it was an interesting approach to saying, instead of us just going blind and selecting one technology or the other, you tested it with the public. So tell us a little bit about that case. Give us the example. Why did the Brazilian city decided to go that route? How was it done? And what were the lessons? Is something that you would recommend other cities? Then I'll move to Jenny, and then I'll go to Jyoti. Cristina.
Thank you, Eddie, for the question. So I think the main reason we are working with the Brazilian cities to test the buses that is still in the country, even though mainly our public transport systems rely on buses, we still doesn't have a lot of e-buses. And based on the Brazilian context and traditional of the manufacturers, we used to have the body of the buses a little bit more heavier than the buses being running in China and others. So there's a lot of questions about the performance of buses with this new structure being electric in the country. Also a lot of questions on the road quality, that a lot of times have holes in the pavement. So if these buses are going to be running in a really good way, and these are really high capital investments, as everyone's probably aware. So what we have been really working with a lot of Brazilian cities, and the example you saw in our blog that I can paste also in our chat a little bit later on, we did a pilot with in Curitiba. That's one of the cities, really open process. So we open a call for pilot buses in the city. We have a lot of the different OEMs bringing their buses and running the city for at least 30 days. So the city could be really testing and monitoring those buses for this entire period, and really be more confident on the technology and which one could be the range, exactly what's going to be the autonomies of the different buses, and really understanding also their needs. Because a lot of times what we are seeing that cities are trying to do is really asking for a much bigger autonomy that they really need for daily operations for buses to really feel more confident in the technology. But this means heavier batteries, means a higher capital cost for those buses. So really giving them this confidence of being able to test different technologies in their own city and relying on the data, because they're not only relying on the systems, so the IT systems, but they have some folks from the city hall really collecting some of the data on a daily basis. So really making them more confident in the technology really help them to make the decision to buy some of the buses. So they already have previously of the tests of the pilots, they already have some targets for 2030 and 2049 to electrify their public transport systems, but they were lacking a little bit of confidence on which technology itself, which bus itself, which autonomy they're going to be requesting to buy those buses. So this test really helped the city, not only the public transport system, so the government, so the city hall, but also the private sector companies to really be able to rely, because Brazil, most of the transport systems, we have the contracts they are run it by private sector companies, so private bus operators. So both sides are right now really more confident on it, and some of their cities are really going for testing a little bit. So we can see how those different technologies that are coming to the market in Brazil have been performing in different realities. And one point that I forgot to mention in the beginning, that also really help cities to go on that, to be more confident that if you look back for 2 years ago, we only have one company that were able to provide e-buses in the Brazilian market. And right now we are looking for 6, 7 companies bringing in the buses. So we have a lot of new companies coming to the market with new products. So this testing and doing that in an open process, and everything is documented, and all the data for those daily operations and the analysis for it are all of them public available with transparency, is really bringing a lot of confidence to the Brazilian market to move forward and buy the buses and increase the number of buses that we have. So just to give a little bit on the size of the Brazilian market overall, in terms of public transport buses, we have about 100,000 buses in the Brazilian market, and we only have less than 200 buses to being electric. So we really need to accelerate a lot the implementation of buses to really be able to decarbonize our public transport systems in Brazil. And most of those, more than 150 of those buses came in the last years. So we are really accelerating speed, and doing those tests is really one step to move forward on that, to really make the confidence in the Brazilian market, in the private sector, and with the investments, and also helping them to have the exact data to create the business models and the contracts and the PPPs that really helps to implement those solutions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cristina. I'm sure that there are going to be lots of questions on this one after your brief summary, because it's really a way to design an open and transparent testing process that reduces the risk for all the stakeholders in the process. I'm going to talk about to Jenny, because when we were preparing this workshop, we came across a publication that she led called PPP contracts in an age of disruption, that really look at some of these issues of technologies. And I love you have many cases that you actually reviewed for the publication. We'd love to hear about one or two, including some that actually didn't work and failed by not incorporating technology development into their thinking. Jenny.
Thank you, Eddie. Yes, I'll put the link for the report, but this is clearly a topic that I have been thinking about and struggling with. And I see Christopher also just put a question in the chat that goes to the heart of the tension, right? In that PPPs, as we all know, are a long-term contract between the private sector and the contracting agency, often for 20, 30 years. And we live in a world where there is constant disruption now, the pace of technological change. And it's a very difficult tension to manage, because on one hand, you can't introduce too much flexibility in this contract, because you have to be able to run a financial model, right, in order for the investment to happen. And with that, you have to have certain assumptions that hold. But then you can't have not enough flexibility, because then you start to run into some of the issues that and getting that balance right is really challenging. And I'll talk about some of the conclusions we came to as we looked at this in the report. But you asked for specific examples, so let me get to those. I think also Mariana earlier made the point that when it comes to thinking about these issues, obviously, it's always the same in everything. Prevention is much better than the cure, right? It's much easier and cheaper to invest in the prevention than to invest in the cure. And so, the way the report is structured, it goes along the project cycle. And there's plenty of advice we can give for how do you structure the contract ex ante before it's signed, to try to account for some of these disruptions. And one of the examples we gave is the desalination plant in Victoria in Australia, where as they were designing the PPP contract, they basically built in incentives for change. So again, how do you address this tension, this inherent tension that we have? One way to do it is to build incentives for the adoption of changing technology. So the way that the Victoria government did this was they said, okay, let's find a way to share the benefits and the costs of technologies, because you can have both, right? Unlike force majeure events, which is another type of disruption where there's only a downside, when we're talking about technological disruption, there could be upsides and downsides, right? And we don't know, and that's the struggle, right? As Christopher was saying, it's unpredictable. That's the nature of it. And so if there is a new technology that would actually reduce costs, improve efficiency in the project, why not allow for that in the contract, right? Have a built-in mechanism where the private party and or the government can propose new technologies. And the way the contract was designed, if the government proposes the new technology, they would pay for it and they would keep the cost savings. If the private party proposes the change, they would pay for it, and then the cost savings would actually be split. But also it's an incentive, because the private sector would still be able to save on the costs, right? So, that way, both parties actually have an incentive to propose when a new technology is there, and the mechanism allows for both, in a situation where somebody has to pay for an additional cost, but also a situation where it anticipates who will gain, who will get to keep the savings. And so it's these types of built-in flexibility that and kind of upfront negotiated agreement on gain sharing that can really help incentivize change through time. Another example of the ex ante is, as you're running your procurement, even at the tendering stage, how do you allow the proposals to be flexible enough that the private party can introduce new technologies in the design of the project, even at the tendering stage? It's tricky. It's much more complex a tender than if you just go out with a technical specification that then people bid on and you choose the lowest cost, right? This is complex and sophisticated, but and the example that was in the report is actually from the United States. So it's you need a certain capacity to do this, but they actually did a dialogue process when they did the tender for a new highway, where they discussed how the bidders would actually amend the specs so that you can incorporate, for example, digital tools to improve congestion, to improve road safety, et cetera, et cetera. But even in developing countries, I think you could do this through just a lot of market sounding and a lot of consulting and making sure that when you're designing your tender to really get as much inputs from the private sector as you can. And then finally, I'm sorry, I know I'm running out of time, but I just want to mention, as Eddie was suggesting, one of the examples where ex post, suddenly there was a lot of disruption and it became a problem. And I think, you know, we picked on Mongolia in the report because that was a personal experience of mine, but frankly, I think you can name a dozen countries where this has happened, where basically when solar was really, you know, becoming a hot new technology. In Europe, as everyone knows, they instituted feed-in tariffs, and some other countries followed suit. And you know, Europe can afford feed-in tariffs. It turns out that many of our client countries cannot. And you know, I think Eddie showed the graph of how much, how quickly the costs went down. And I think in the span of 5 years, we went from feed-in tariffs to auctions at like 3-cent bids, right? And so in Mongolia, this happened in their neighboring country, and I think it was Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, ran a solar auction and came in at 3 or 4 cents when they were stuck in PPAs that had actually just started, where the projects were freshly constructed, and they still had 15 or 20 more years and left on the contract, and they were paying 15 cents. And, you know, and this is a small country with, you know, people who, you know, of course, those costs get passed down to people and consumers that end up suffering through really high electricity tariffs. So it is a little bit unconscionable. And from a public interest perspective, there's one thing you can do. And then from a legal perspective, because I'm also a lawyer at the end of the day, it's very, very, very difficult to renegotiate and reopen these contracts. So let me stop there, but it is a cautionary tale. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny, for those both developed and developing country experiences in that process. And if you have any questions, please make sure that you put them in the chat function. Jyoti, examples, cases that you have seen either from your experience in the World Bank, UN, or now with WAPPP.
Yes, thank you, Ade. I think it all these points, which actually you've covered in your presentation, and Mariana and Jenny and Cristina, I think they're all kind of coalescing. You know, I think the technology, I think that the topic of this session today is very important to understand that it's not just the solution, the way the technology is used in terms of, for example, the electric buses versus, you know, gas buses. But it's also the process of actually how the projects have been screened at the government, at the PPP units, or at the contracting authorities level in the public investment management, how those projects have been prepared using the technology in terms of not just the preparation, the process, but also really thinking about how these projects can be more innovative and more cost saving, more affordable, resilient, and bringing it to the governments and adding value to the users, not just to the government, but also to the future generations, value for future generations. So I think that technology is really fundamental to the entire PPP process, and we need to keep that in mind. And I think the two examples which I want to really share with you, it comes from this initiative which we have undertaken in WAPPP, which is called small scale PPPs. And you know, a lot of the talk about PPPs which we have today is about those large scale projects which are attracting FDI, but they are very, very few projects. And people really, especially in the developing countries, have to understand that there are very few projects, and the dynamics of those projects are very different than the small scale projects, which are more common in countries and are more difficult to attract private sector. So this project is for public lighting in Serbia, for example, and really going to some of the comments and the questions in the chat is the bidding was actually done on electricity consumption savings. And that was actually a criteria in the bidding and the payment. And this actually brings to the agility in the contract as well, that, you know, you can actually change, and these are small, I mean, these are small projects, and lighting is, yes, the new technology for that particular area in Serbia is probably an innovation, but over time, lighting is not going to have these big jumps in technology, but the agility in the contract is really being, the KPI is really the savings to the public sector, and 94% of those savings are actually paid to the private partner. And that's how this contract is becomes resilient, and the private partner is constantly thinking, okay, how I can continue the savings. Now, the second project is in Austria. It's a solid waste project. And this is a digitalization of the process itself. I mean, solid waste, the solution itself is probably doesn't have a lot of technological change, but the process and one of the criteria actually for the bidding was that how the billing can be digitalized and how it can be seamlessly linked to other forms of public sector billing, so the users actually find it easier, and also the information, the data, that not just the tariffs but the usage. So the disclosure of information as well is based on technology. So these are some of the bidding criteria, and at the same time, the co-billing strategy is part of the pricing. Is for the private partner. So in the bidding criteria and also in the KPI, and that has really made this small project resilient and really bringing the technology innovation in terms of infrastructure service to the users.
Thank you so very much, Jyoti. So for highlighting particularly, that is not just the fancy larger scale infrastructure projects that need to look at technology, that actually even on the smaller scale PPPs, that can be truly transformative and change business model, delivery models, everything around that process altogether. And now you heard Mariana, you heard my opening speech, you heard each other into this process. We want to start looking at practical recommendations that you would give to partners or to clients that are embarking into PPPs that have a technology component. Things that you would recommend for sure to do, things to avoid in very practical terms. We find that these advice among practitioners has been one of the most attractive features of this workshop series. So again, I'll move around the panel and I'll start with Jenny, then I'll go to Jyoti, and then Cristina. Jenny, advice, things for sure to pay attention to and things to avoid.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. So I have a list, and my first one on my list is, I have to put it first, is the direction of travel is going to be on, as Mariana was saying as well, green technology, climate smart technology, climate solutions. If you have a choice between technology that's cleaner and a technology that's less clean, I would always say, you know, read the writing on the wall and choose the cleaner technology, because it is the direction of travel right now. And I used to be based in Indonesia before I moved to Mozambique. And I have to say, we spent a lot of time in Indonesia and effort unraveling all of the code deals, or trying to unravel, I should say, all of the code deals that happened just before everyone realized that they were not a good idea. And again, it is very, very hard once you actually have gone into these contracts. So when you start, when looking at technologies that, you know, are based on fuel combustion, fossil fuels, etc., ask yourself, you know, in 20 years, in 30 years, what is going to be the state of play of my fuel, of my investments, of my investors, you know, and I would always try to go for the greener solution. I would say, actually, my second point was also raised by Christopher in the chat. Yes, we talked a lot about anticipating change in the contract, but again, you can't foresee everything. There's a certain amount of flexibility that needs to be retained that will not be accounted for. And so if any of you have been in the PPP world long enough, you've probably heard my colleague Jeff Delman speak, and he always talks about PPP as a marriage, and like a marriage. And it is about the relationship between the two parties in the contract, right? If you maintain a positive relationship, if you build a positive relationship, a trusting relationship, when there's an issue, you can just discuss it. And sometimes that's what you need to do. Sometimes you have to go sit down at a table with the partners and say, we have a problem, how are we going to solve this problem in a way that's fair and reasonable. The other thing I would say, this is a bit technical, but there are actually legal principles that exist to try to maintain this fairness in contract that isn't prescriptive. And so the principles are around things like economic equilibrium, equity in contract, where basically courts around the world have decided that they won't allow for unfair contracts. And so these have worked in European courts, for example, when there is really an unbalance in the contract, and if the amicable negotiation does not go, there have been ways to kind of use these legal principles. And you can consider discuss with your legal team, of course, but you can consider even building in those principles upfront in the contract rather than, more prescriptive solutions. I also have a point on insurance and trying to see what risks can be pushed to the private sector. I think most of this audience is government. That's of course our clients as well. Often in these cases, there is an imbalance also just at the start with the negotiations. And I think it is really important to remember that there are certain risks, and technological obsolescence might even be one of them, where you can see if it's possible to have the private sector might be the best place to handle it, and including insurance markets. And then my last one, and I wouldn't be the World Bank if I don't mention this, the underlying sector and the strength of the underlying sector is really important too, because we're not going to get it right every time. And like I mentioned earlier, Europe had the ability to absorb the feed-in tariffs, right? Even they had the ability to absorb a series of contracts that were frankly probably too expensive in the long run. Our clients do not have that ability. It is really important to continue to work on the financial viability of the underlying sector so that it can absorb some certain shocks, and it also will allow you to access guarantees, access other push more risks to the private sector because they are more comfortable with other risks like so please keep working on the sector. And in my current sector now, I've moved over to the energy team. What we're seeing is as the market liberalizes, you don't have these long-term contracts anymore, and the market naturally accounts for technological change because it's a liberal market, because you're not relying on government offtake. And so there's not that equivalent in every sector, I understand, but thinking along those lines of how do we create a market that is more market-based and less reliant on long-term government payments is actually maybe positive for everyone. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Jenny, thank you so much for the long list, but a very practical list in that direction. Jyoti, reflections, advice, you can pick small transactions, but also from the WAPP experience. What would you say to your members when they're asking these type of questions?
Thank you, Ade. I think I don't want to repeat what Jenny said. Actually, excellent point. So I think I have 3 points which I want to emphasize. First one is start early. Second one is don't straitjacket technical solution. And third one is change is the only constant. So the first one, start early. Don't wait till the PPP contract. If these solutions and this conversation and discussion is happening with the private sector at the negotiation table, then it's way too late. That means, and we are talking in the context of developing countries where the capacity to prepare and implement PPP projects is not as at the level of many of the developed PPP markets, and governments are still trying to leapfrog these technological changes. And so if at the negotiation table, there is a surprise of a technology and they're negotiating the solution, then it's way too late, because the thinking behind and the screening process and those feasibility studies, which are really, really key to a success of a project. Remember, why are we doing this project? Is to benefit the users, to benefit the communities, to benefit the stakeholders. So if that analysis hasn't been done, what value does it bring to those communities where this road is being built, where this power plant is being built, where these buses are being facilitated, or those bus depots are being built? It's really too late. So start early. And that also means that the conversation needs to happen not just with the PPP unit of that particular country, but it needs to be really at the fundamental of Ministry of Education, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Environment, and Ministry of Finance. And they may not like it, but it needs to happen. It's not a fast process. And that's where I think all of us together, all the stakeholders which we are here, including the audience, we're all working on this particular aspect, which is the most tricky part. Second one is don't straitjacket. Don't focus on the technology solution. Focus on what the needs are from the communities and what we are trying to achieve. And looking at some of the comments and questions, really looking at the outcome. What are the outcomes? So, for example, the example which I gave in Serbia, it is really based on cost savings. So if you're focusing on the cost savings in your bidding and in your KPI to partner with the private sector, then it's really up to the private partner to bring new technology and solutions to the table when they're putting up their bid. And that also gives a market signal to the market, in the private market, that the government really knows what it's doing. And it understands what we are going to propose is going to have an impact in their negotiation, in their discussions. So we are having an equal partner on the table when we come to the negotiation table. So don't straitjacket a technological solution, but focus on what the needs and the solutions are to suffice that need. And private sector will do what it does best. It will bring the best solution to the table. The third one is really the change is the only constant. And whether it's a regulated sector or it's a non-regulated sector. And as we move forward, and I want to emphasize actually on more adaptation and resilience, not on mitigation, because most of the discussion, unfortunately, and as you've seen on the climate finance data, over 90% of the finance is actually going on mitigation, not enough on adaptation. But if we don't focus on adaptation and making these systems resilient, then we are not going to really reach the goal which we are planning to get, which is a holistic solution, not just including climate action, but also having a happy and a healthy planet to live in for the future generation. So change is the only constant in a way that the contract really needs to anticipate how the systems, how the processes can become resilient, how it can withstand those extreme events which are going to happen. For example, digitalization, in the other example which I gave, if the co-billing strategy, for example, was again part of the bidding and the contract, that really means that the users are part of the solutions. They are seeing the data. The e-government is extremely important, and that made that project more resilient to any event which may happen down the road. And thinking of these things, and again, the private partner will come up with these solutions, give them the tools, but don't tell them which tool to use. All right, so I'll stop there. Thank you, Ade.
Thank you very much. Let's go to then Cristina. So thoughts, advice for either cities in Brazil, but also this is a challenge that many cities around the world are facing. So things to do, things to avoid.
So thank you. And I think my colleagues have said most of the things I was thinking to say, but I would try to bring a little bit some ideas around it, but I could not agree more with what has been already said. But what I have put here is really define the goal that you are looking to achieve with your PPP. So I think Jyoti just said that. So not looking for the technology, but really defining what's the overall goal. So if it's reducing costs, if it's decarbonizing, what exactly is the goal as a starting point for that, so we can have the process to deploy these technologies with the different stakeholders engaged. The second point I really want to reinforce is, for really good PPPs projects, we really need to respect the process. So including everyone that's going to be part, because a lot of times what we are seeing is that some country cities are really looking to jump straight to the contract itself without respecting the entire process to doing the studies, the pre-feasibility studies, and everything to really come out with the best solutions, with the best contract, with the responsibilities to achieve their overall goal for that. And the other point I really want to reinforce that we have been saying not only in Brazil, but some other places, that we really need to understand the local context, being the country or the city. So it's not a content-based, even though we are looking to have the same overall goal for other projects, we need to be able to learn with those projects, see what was the successful factors for that specific application, for that specific implementation, but see how this could be translated to your own reality. So your local regulations, your local context, and really adapt that for delivering our overall good project in the end. So really having being inspired by other projects, but not replicating exactly these, because we have been seeing some cases that this could bring a lot of issues throughout the project and the contract itself. And the final point I really want to reinforce, but I also think my colleagues already brought that, we know that in these long-term contracts, so 15, 20, 30 years contracts of PPPs, we know that it's going to have changes and things are not going to be predicted in day one when we sign the contract. So we need to have these things, bring it into the contract since the beginning. So the first mayor that Marcela and the others already mentioned, and some others really need to be part of the project since the beginning, the PPP structuring process. So we know that when those things comes in, we have ways to come out with these two parties, as Jenny just said, like the marriage. So how we can bring this to the conversation, have those agreements based on what was not predicted, because we cannot see the size of the impact, but we need to have a common ground to start these conversations to move forward. So these was the points I want to add a little bit, but I think all of them were already mentioned by my colleagues before.
So I want to thank the panelists. Very practical recommendations, very practical things to do and not to do. I think that I've seen several comments in the chat room saying how exciting this conversation is. I have 4 questions that have come up that are general. So I'm going to let you pick and choose which question you prefer to answer. First one, does disruptive technologies means that we need to disrupt the whole PPP structure that is being used? What are you thinking of? What is the future of PPP contract structure? Second, many clients sometimes are fascinated by new technologies and they want to just use them for PPPs. But how do you balance affordability and new technologies when you are advising somebody who is really fascinated by the latest gadget? Third, the role of insurance. We see the insurance industry trying to play a role in the adoption of new climate technologies. What are your thoughts on that? How can they be helpful? And finally, what is the role of the regulator? Not the PPP administrator and the agency, but the regulator of the sector into all of this equation. We haven't heard much about the regulators in that process. Let me follow the same order. Let's go to Jenny, Jyoti, and Cristina. And if for any reason I get disconnected, Victoria is going to pick up from me and close the seminar after we hear from you. I hope to stay connected, but we always want to have a backup option at all times. Jenny, Jyoti, Cristina, we want your thoughts. You can pick one or all of the questions.
Okay, thanks, Eddie. Well, I'll let my colleagues also give it a chance to speak, so I won't speak to all your questions, but I think the first one on, what is the future of PPPs, let's say, I think is a really interesting one. It's also something that, I thought about a lot while working on the report, but I was actually, so I don't speak Portuguese. I was brought to Mozambique because there's a huge PPP that's ongoing here that's going to be very, very important, I think, for the region. I think in certain circumstances, it's still very important, right? Because in the case of this one, it's a large hydro project. It's huge amounts of investment. There is, it can really change the whole energy sector in the region. It's going to be a cross-border project, highly complex, of course, new technology. It's also a lot of environmental and social issues, long-term maintenance and operations. You need, it is a no-brainer to bring in the private sector and have a long-term partnership in something very strategic and large in that circumstance. And that's just one example. I mean, I don't mean to, say that only mega projects should be PPPs, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that there are still many, many instances where the whole rationale for PPPs makes a lot of sense. where you need the expertise and the efficiency gains that the private sector can bring, where you need their capital, but you also want them to continue in the longer term on the operation and maintenance so that there's sustainability in the project. And I'm sure, you know, everyone can think of many examples. BRTs, LRTs are also another great example of that. So at the same time, I will go back to what I said at the very end of my last intervention, which is, it's interesting that the more you think about these issues, the more you see that the final solution to some of these problems may be, in certain circumstances, a more market liberalization where there's different structures and different, there's different, basically, structures in place for the market beyond relying on government agencies. And this actually goes then to the next question on affordability. I do think sometimes it's unfair for us to ask a contracting agency to be on the hook, especially if you're talking about structures where there's, availability payments, or there's basically, the offtake or the payer of the contract is the government or contracting agency. It's not always fair to ask them and ultimately the consumers and the taxpayers to bear the burden, right? And so how do we manage that? And I think in terms of affordability, it's a fair point. And actually, I was thinking about it also when I was saying, always go for the greener solution. Yes, often today still the greener solution is more expensive. And you do have to balance that with affordability, and you do have to, run your models and make sure that the project makes economic sense. I think, it was mentioned earlier too. At the same time, I guess the question is it looking at the upfront costs, what are they over time? And the only point I made on the fossil fuels is we don't know what the cost of gas is going to be 10 years from now. We don't know what the cost of coal is going to be, but all indicators are that they're going to go up, right? And so let's think longer term when you're making these investment decisions, because from an affordability perspective, the costs actually really start to increase later on, and who is taking that risk.
Let me answer the question, actually the last question, the role of the regulators. And I think it's the most tricky because, regulators don't necessarily are part of the PPP contract. But regulatory risk is actually one of the biggest, one of the riskiest risk especially in emerging markets in a PPP contract. And regulators are really looking to protect the consumers. They're looking at affordability issues. They're setting the tariff. They're looking at how to really adjust the overall sectoral dynamics, which really protects the buyers of that particular service. And every sector is different. And of course, energy being the most regulated sector in all the infrastructure sectors which we are discussing here has the most and also the most PPPs so far. And it's just, it's a longer conversation why there are more PPPs in the energy sector than in other sector. But I think if you look at water, where there's a regulator, transport, not as much. It's very driven by, subsectors, and not as much as regulator, but as much as really the relationship between the ministry and the agencies which are undertaking those projects. And then you have education, you have all the other social sectors. The role of the regulator is extremely important. And it really takes, and actually I'm going through this particular conversation in a country in Africa. And there's a significant time lag because the regulation is connected to the law in that country. And regulation is also connected to what is happening in the sector. At the ground level, which is what the PPP contracts are trying to do. So sometimes it's bottoms up, sometimes it's top down, but there is a significant delay. I would say even at the minimum, it's a two-year delay. We're not talking about weeks or months, at least a 2-year delay on how the regulators actually are reacting to these things. And this is a serious issue. Because not only today, the regulatory risk is one of the biggest risks in PPP contracts, but as we are changing so rapidly and trying to react, and again, we are still reacting to climate and what is happening around us politically, in terms of international foreign debt, and inflation and all those pressures which we are having, regulators are still reacting. So I think it's a very important issue, and we do need to pay attention to this. Thank you.
I'm going also to talk a little bit on the last questions, even though Jyoti already talked about, because this is one thing that when we're talking about the Brazilian context and e-buses is happening a lot, that we go a lot of times when cities are trying to do some PPPs contracts to the court. So with a lot of, even though we don't have a regulator itself, we're going to the justice because they're having a lot of questions. So I think they have a really important role as regulators to, as Jyoti was just saying, to make sure that things are being done properly, but we have been also trying to engage a lot of them throughout the process. So as we talked at the other times, so if we have recommendations or things, so really respecting the process and understanding that when we're talking about innovations that we are bringing to contracts and PPPs, that we also need to take into consideration those conversations with the regulators when we have a proper one for the sector itself, but when we don't have, we know that the courts could have a lot of questions to understand why exactly you are choosing a much more expensive technology through environmental issues to cleaner solutions and look into the future, how we are going to engage them into the process. So I think these ones, from my personal perspectives, connect a little bit the role of regulators and the future of PPPs, that we need to take this into consideration as part of the process and how we are going to roll out better contracts to deliver the best solutions, but respecting, as I said in my previous answers, the process, but also the different perspectives of regulators, courts, to make sure we are going to deliver the best results when we have a clear goal for the project itself.
Okay, thank you so much, Cristina. So with that, we'll close out our panel discussion. Apologies from Eddie, who's struggling with connection issues. So I will close everything out for us today. Cristina, Jyoti, Jenny, thank you for being part of the panel discussion today and sharing your experience and expertise with all of our participants. Also to all of the attendees, thank you for your active contribution in the chat and for listening so thoroughly and asking such great questions. We hope that what we've presented and shared with you today helps you in everything that you're pulling together for your PPP projects. So with that, we say thank you. On Thursday, the 5th of September, we will have our last and final workshop of this workshop series. It's going to focus on new sources of public financing for PPPs. So please join us then. I will be sending out a reminder. We can't wait to close out this successful workshop series with you then. Thank you again, and everybody have a good evening, good afternoon, or rest of your morning.